August 28, 2013, a warm summer evening in Brown County, Ohio. 22-year-old Brittany Sheree Stykes buckled her 4-month-old daughter into the back seat of her yellow Jeep Wrangler. The young mother was pregnant with her second child, her face glowing with the promise of expanding family joy. She kissed her toddler's forehead before sliding behind the wheel. The drive along State Route 68 near Ripley should have been routine. Brittany had traveled this road countless times. The fields stretched endlessly on both sides, golden in the fading light. Her daughter babbled happily in the back seat. Then gunfire shattered the peace. Multiple shots struck the Jeep. The vehicle lurched, tires screaming against asphalt before careening into an embankment. Passersby rushed to the wreckage, calling 911 with trembling hands. They found Britney unresponsive, her life already gone. Her daughter, impossibly, was still breathing despite a gunshot wound to her tiny head. More than a decade has passed. The case remains unsolved. But what really happened on that quiet country road? Before we get into the story, drop a comment with your country and the time right now. The yellow Jeep Wrangler sat in the driveway like a beacon of normalcy. Brittany Stikes emerged from her modest Brown County home, her pregnant belly showing beneath a loose summer dress. The August heat shimmered off the pavement, but a gentle breeze carried the scent of freshly cut grass from neighboring yards. Her 4-month-old daughter tottered toward the vehicle on unsteady legs, giggling as Brittany scooped her up. The toddler's dark eyes sparkled with innocent joy, oblivious to the world's dangers. Brittany kissed the child's cheek, breathing in that sweet baby smell that made her heart swell with protective love. "Ready for our little adventure, sweetheart?" she whispered, securing the car seat with practiced efficiency. Her wedding ring caught the late afternoon sun as she adjusted the straps. At 22, Brittany had already built a life centered on family and faith. Her husband worked hard to provide for them, and soon they would welcome another child into their growing circle of love. The Jeep's engine turned over with a familiar rumble. Brittany adjusted her rearview mirror, checking on her daughter one last time before backing out of the driveway. The child had already found her favorite toy, a small stuffed animal that rarely left her side. Everything felt perfectly ordinary, beautifully mundane. State Route 68 stretched ahead like a ribbon through Brown County's rolling countryside. Cornfields lined both sides of the two-lane road, their green stalks reaching toward a sky painted in soft pastels. This was Ohio farmland at its most peaceful, where generations of families had raised children and built quiet, meaningful lives. Brittany drove carefully, mindful of her precious cargo. The radio played softly, a country song about small-town dreams and endless possibilities. She hummed along, one hand resting on her growing belly where her second child grew strong. Life felt full of promise, rich with the simple joys that mattered most. The sun began its descent toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the fields. Other vehicles passed, occasionally pickup trucks heading home from work, an elderly farmer in his weathered sedan. Everyone in Brown County knew these roads, had traveled them thousands of times. They represented safety, familiarity, community bonds that stretched back decades. Brittany's phone buzzed with a text message, but she ignored it. Driving demanded her full attention, especially with her daughter depending on her protection. The baby had grown quiet in the back seat, perhaps lulled by the Jeep's gentle motion. These were the moments Brittany treasured most, just her and her child, moving through the world together. The road curved gently ahead, following the natural contours of the landscape. No other traffic was visible in either direction. The cornfields seemed to whisper in the evening breeze, a sound that had comforted countless travelers on this same stretch of highway. Everything appeared exactly as it should be on a peaceful summer evening in rural Ohio. Then the first gunshot exploded through the twilight. The windshield spiderwebbed instantly, fragments of glass showering the interior. Brittany's scream caught in her throat as she fought to control the steering wheel. More shots followed in rapid succession, each one finding its mark with terrifying precision. The Jeep lurched violently to the right, tires squealing against hot asphalt. Time seemed to slow and accelerate simultaneously. The yellow vehicle careened off the roadway, bouncing through the shallow ditch before slamming into the earthen embankment with a sickening crunch of metal and glass. Steam hissed from the damaged radiator as the engine died with a final shudder. Silence returned to State Route 68, broken only by the distant sound of crying from the back seat. Two vehicles approached the crash scene almost simultaneously. The first was driven by Robert Henderson, a local farmer heading home after checking on his cattle. The second carried Maria Santos, a nurse finishing her shift at the county medical center. Both drivers had traveled this road countless times, but nothing could have prepared them for what they discovered. Henderson saw the crumpled yellow Jeep first, his headlights illuminating the destruction. He pulled over immediately, his hands shaking as he reached for his cell phone. The vehicle had struck the embankment with tremendous force. The front end completely caved in. Steam rose from the engine compartment like ghostly fingers in the gathering darkness. Santos arrived seconds later, her medical training taking over despite the shock. She grabbed her emergency kit from the trunk and rushed toward the wreckage. The driver's door hung open at an unnatural angle, revealing the devastating scene within. Brittany Stikes lay motionless behind the wheel, her young life already claimed by multiple gunshot wounds. But from the backseat came the sound that would haunt both witnesses forever, the weak but persistent crying of a wounded child. The 4-month-old girl remained strapped in her car seat, blood trickling from a head wound that should have been fatal. Her stuffed animal lay on the floor, a small casualty in an incomprehensible act of violence. Henderson's 911 call crackled through the emergency dispatch system at exactly 8:47 p.m. His voice trembled as he tried to describe the scene, struggling to find words for such senseless brutality. Santos had already begun triage, checking Brittany's vital signs while simultaneously assessing the child's condition. "We need life flight," she told the dispatcher, her professional composure barely containing her emotional turmoil. "The mother is deceased, but the baby is alive. Gunshot wound to the head, but she's breathing on her own." Emergency vehicles began converging on the scene within minutes. The flashing red and blue lights transformed the quiet countryside into a surreal landscape of crisis and chaos. State troopers secured the perimeter while paramedics worked frantically to stabilize the wounded child for transport to Cincinnati Children's Hospital. Sheriff Mike Thompson arrived just as the helicopter lifted off, its rotors beating against the night sky like mechanical thunder. He had served Brown County for over 2 decades, but nothing in his experience had prepared him for this level of violence. Young mothers didn't get gunned down on rural highways without reason, yet the scene before him defied all logical explanation. The Jeep told its own story through bullet holes and blood spatter. Multiple shots had been fired from outside the vehicle, suggesting either a planned ambush or a random act of unspeakable cruelty. No valuables appeared to have been taken, ruling out robbery as a motive. Brittany's purse remained untouched, her wedding ring still on her finger. Deputies began the methodical process of evidence collection, marking shell casings and documenting the trajectory of each bullet. Crime scene tape fluttered in the evening breeze as investigators photographed every angle, every detail that might eventually lead to justice. The work continued long into the night, illuminated by portable floodlights that cast stark shadows across the devastation. News of the shooting spread through Brown County like wildfire. By dawn, radio stations and local newspapers were reporting the basic facts: a young mother dead, her baby fighting for life at Cincinnati Children's Hospital. Social media amplified the horror, transforming a local tragedy into regional headline news. The Stikes family gathered at the hospital, their lives forever changed by a single phone call in the middle of the night. Brittany's parents, grandparents themselves for barely more than a year, now faced the dual reality of losing their daughter while praying for their granddaughter's survival. The waiting room became a sanctuary of grief and hope, filled with whispered prayers and tear-stained faces. Dr. Patricia Williams, the pediatric neurosurgeon leading the child's care, delivered cautiously optimistic updates every few hours. The bullet had grazed the toddler's skull, but miraculously avoided penetrating the brain itself. Surgery had been successful in cleaning the wound and relieving pressure, but the next 48 hours would be critical. "She's a fighter, doctor," Williams told the family, her professional demeanor softened by genuine compassion. "Children are remarkably resilient, and she's already showing signs of responsiveness. We have every reason to hope for a full recovery." The community response was immediate and overwhelming. Churches organized prayer vigils, local businesses collected donations for medical expenses, and volunteers organized meal trains for the grieving family. Brown County's population of just over 44,000 had always prided itself on taking care of its own. But this level of tragedy tested everyone's faith and resilience. Sheriff Thompson held his first press conference at the county courthouse, facing a crowd of reporters and concerned citizens. The questions came fast and hard. Was this a random shooting? Did Brittany have any enemies? Was there a threat to public safety? His answers were necessarily limited by the ongoing investigation, but his commitment was absolute. "We will not rest until we find who did this," he declared, his voice carrying the weight of personal promise. Brittany Stikes was a young mother with her whole life ahead of her. Her daughter deserves to grow up knowing justice was served. This community deserves to feel safe again. Behind the scenes, investigators were already pursuing multiple leads. Britney's cell phone records were subpoenaed, her social media accounts scrutinized, her daily routines mapped in detail. Friends and family members sat through lengthy interviews, their grief compounded by the necessity of reliving painful memories in service of the investigation. The Ohio Bureau of Criminal Investigation deployed their mobile crime lab to Brown County, bringing advanced forensic capabilities to bear on the evidence. Ballistics experts examined the shell casings found at the scene, hoping to match them to weapons in existing databases. The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit was consulted to develop a preliminary profile of the shooter. Yet despite all the resources and expertise brought to bear, the case presented a frustrating puzzle. Britney appeared to have been a random target, driving a familiar route at a routine time. She had no known enemies, no involvement in dangerous activities, no obvious connection to criminal elements. The shooting seemed to emerge from nowhere, striking with devastating precision before vanishing back into the Ohio countryside. The crime scene on State Route 68 told a story written in bullet trajectories and blood evidence. Detective Sarah Martinez of the Brown County Sheriff's Office had worked dozens of violent crimes, but this one felt different from the moment she arrived. The meticulous nature of the shooting suggested planning, yet the apparent randomness of the victim selection defied conventional criminal logic. Martinez coordinated with Agent Kevin Walsh from the Ohio Bureau of Criminal Investigation, pooling their expertise to reconstruct the sequence of events. The shell casings indicated the shooter had used a high-powered rifle, firing from a concealed position approximately 150 yards from the road. Each shot had been carefully aimed, suggesting familiarity with firearms and possibly military or law enforcement training. This wasn't some punk kid with a Saturday night special, Walsh observed, examining the ballistics evidence through a magnifying glass. Whoever did this knew exactly what they were doing. They picked their position, waited for the right moment, and executed a plan with military precision. The investigation team expanded to include FBI Special Agent Diana Foster, whose expertise in violent crime analysis brought federal resources to bear on the case. Foster's arrival signaled the seriousness with which authorities were treating the shooting, elevating it from local tragedy to multi-jurisdictional priority. Crime scene technicians worked methodically through the evidence, collecting samples that might eventually yield DNA or other identifying information. The shooter's position was carefully mapped and searched, but no physical evidence remained. The perpetrator had been disciplined enough to police their brass and leave no trace of their presence. Investigators began the painstaking process of background checks on everyone in Britney's life. Her husband submitted to lengthy questioning, his grief compounded by the terrible necessity of proving his innocence. Friends, co-workers, and even casual acquaintances found themselves under scrutiny as detectives searched for any connection that might explain the violence. "We have to assume this was targeted until we can prove otherwise," Detective Martinez explained to the family during one of many difficult conversations. "Random shootings like this are extremely rare. There's usually a connection we haven't found yet, a reason someone wanted Britney dead." The community struggled to process this new reality. Brown County had always been a place where people left their doors unlocked, where children played outside until dark without fear. The shooting shattered that sense of security, replacing it with suspicion and paranoia that poisoned even the most innocent interactions. Local gun shops reported increased sales as residents armed themselves against an undefined threat. Parents kept their children closer, altered their driving routes, installed security systems they had never thought necessary. The ripple effects of violence extended far beyond the immediate victims, transforming an entire community's relationship with safety and trust. At Cincinnati Children's Hospital, Britney's daughter fought the battle of her young life. The surgical team had worked through the night to repair the damage from her head wound, their skill and dedication creating a miracle from what should have been certain tragedy. The child's grandmother maintained a constant vigil, holding tiny hands and whispering lullabies through tears. Dr. Williams provided regular updates that became beacons of hope in the darkness of grief. The child's vital signs remained stable, her neurological responses encouraging. Each small movement, every fleeting smile, represented victory over the forces that had tried to destroy an innocent family. "She opened her eyes this morning and looked right at me," the grandmother reported to gathered family members, her voice breaking with emotion. It was like she was saying she's not giving up, that she's going to fight through this for her mama. The intensive care unit became a focal point for the extended family's grief and healing. Relatives traveled from across Ohio and neighboring states to offer support, creating an informal network of love and determination. They took turns reading stories, singing songs, and simply being present for a child who had already endured more trauma than anyone should experience in a lifetime. News media began covering the child's recovery with the same intensity they had devoted to the crime itself. Her survival story captured public imagination, transforming her from victim to symbol of resilience. Donations poured in from strangers moved by her plight, creating a trust fund that would ensure her future educational and medical needs were met. The FBI's involvement brought additional resources to the investigation, including access to national databases and behavioral analysis expertise. Agent Foster coordinated with local authorities to expand the scope of the inquiry, looking for similar crimes in other jurisdictions that might indicate a serial offender. "We're casting a wide net," she explained to Sheriff Thompson during one of their daily briefings. "This level of planning and execution suggests someone with experience. They might have done this before, or they might do it again. We can't afford to think of this as an isolated incident until we know for certain." The investigation team grew to include specialists in forensic accounting, digital forensics, and criminal psychology. Every aspect of Britney's life was examined in minute detail, from her high school yearbooks to her most recent credit card purchases. The goal was to find the thread that would unravel the mystery, the connection that would transform a senseless act into a solvable crime. The Ohio Bureau of Criminal Investigation's Mobile Forensics Unit represented the state's most advanced capabilities for processing violent crime scenes. Lead criminalist Dr. Robert Chen had worked hundreds of cases over his 15-year career, but the precision and planning evident in Britney's murder set it apart from typical violent crimes. "The shooter demonstrated exceptional discipline, Dr. Chen explained to the assembled investigative team. They selected an optimal firing position, waited for the target to enter the kill zone, and executed the attack with military efficiency. This wasn't a crime of passion or opportunity, it was an execution." The ballistics analysis revealed the use of a .308 Winchester rifle, a common hunting caliber that would not attract attention in rural Ohio. However, the modification patterns on the recovered bullets suggested custom handloads, indicating the shooter's familiarity with ammunition preparation. This level of detail might eventually lead to identification through purchasing records or reloading equipment. DNA analysis of evidence collected from the scene yielded no results. The shooter had been careful not to leave biological trace evidence, another indication of planning and criminal sophistication. Even tire impressions from the shooter's vehicle had been obscured by subsequent traffic, eliminating another potential avenue for identification. Agent Walsh coordinated with the FBI's National Crime Information Center to search for similar cases nationwide. The query parameters included high-powered rifle attacks on vehicles, targeted shootings of young mothers, and crimes involving children as secondary victims. The database search would take time, but any matches might reveal patterns invisible to local investigators. Sheriff Thompson faced increasing pressure from both the media and the community for progress in the case. Daily press briefings became exercises in managing expectations while maintaining public confidence in the investigation. The questions grew more pointed with each passing day. Did police have any suspects? Was the community safe? When would there be an arrest? "We're following every lead, pursuing every possibility," Thompson assured reporters and concerned citizens. "This investigation has our full attention and resources. We won't stop until we find who did this to Britney and her baby." The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit provided a preliminary profile of the offender based on crime scene analysis and victimology. The shooter was likely male, aged 25 to 45, with military or law enforcement training. He probably lived within 50 miles of Brown County and had some connection to the area that made him comfortable operating there. The profile would help focus investigative efforts, but it also described thousands of potential suspects. The silence that followed the initial burst of investigative activity felt heavier than the chaos that had preceded it. Weeks passed without significant developments, leads grew cold, and the reality of an unsolved case began to settle over Brown County like morning fog. The community's initial shock transformed into a deeper, more persistent anxiety about safety and justice. Britney's family maintained their vigil at the hospital while simultaneously planning a funeral that would honor her memory and celebrate her life. The juxtaposition of grief and hope, of endings and beginnings, reflected the complex emotions everyone felt as the child's recovery continued against all medical odds. The memorial service drew hundreds of mourners from across southern Ohio. Friends from high school, co-workers, neighbors, and complete strangers united in their determination to remember Britney as more than just a victim of violence. They shared stories of her kindness, her dreams for her growing family, and her infectious optimism about the future. Pastor Michael Edwards delivered a eulogy that tried to make sense of senseless loss while providing comfort to those who would continue living with questions that might never be answered. His words echoed through the packed church and beyond, carried by local media to viewers who had followed the story from its horrific beginning to this moment of collective mourning. Britney's life was cut short, but her impact continues through everyone she touched, Pastor Edwards declared. Her daughter's survival reminds us that even in darkness, light persists. Even when evil seems to triumph, love endures. We may not understand why this happened, but we can choose how we respond. The investigation team faced the grim reality that their case was becoming a cold case despite their best efforts. All obvious leads had been exhausted, all logical suspects eliminated, all forensic evidence processed without yielding actionable intelligence. The shooter had seemingly vanished into the Ohio landscape, leaving behind only questions and grief. Detective Martinez coordinated with the National Crime Information Center to ensure all case details were properly entered into federal databases. This step would allow comparison with future cases and might eventually reveal connections invisible to current analysis. The NCIC entry would remain active indefinitely, a permanent flag in the system that might one day trigger a match with new evidence. The FBI's involvement began to scale back as federal resources were redirected to more promising cases. Agent Foster assured local authorities that the Bureau would respond immediately if new developments warranted federal attention, but day-to-day responsibility returned to Brown County investigators who would carry this burden for years to come. 1 year after Britney's murder, Brown County gathered to remember her life and renew their commitment to finding her killer. The anniversary brought fresh media attention to the case, with television reporters conducting interviews and newspaper articles recounting the tragic details that had shocked the community 12 months earlier. The vigil took place at the Ripley Community Center, where hundreds of candles flickered against the August evening darkness. Britney's family stood together at the front of the crowd, their faces reflecting both the pain of loss and the strength that had carried them through the most difficult year of their lives. Sheriff Thompson addressed the gathering with words carefully chosen to balance honesty about the investigation's challenges with determination to continue the search for justice. "We have not forgotten Britney," he declared to the assembled crowd. "We will never forget her. This case remains our top priority, and we continue to follow every lead, pursue every possibility." The child's recovery had progressed remarkably well, defying early medical predictions about potential long-term effects from her head injury. Now walking and beginning to speak her first words, she represented a living miracle that provided comfort to those struggling with the senseless violence that had claimed her mother's life. Local media coverage of the anniversary rekindled public interest in the case, generating dozens of new tips that investigators carefully evaluated and pursued. Most led nowhere, but each call represented community members' continued engagement with the search for answers. The sheriff's office had established a dedicated tip line that remained active, staffed by detectives who took every piece of information seriously. The FBI's involvement had transitioned to a consulting role, with agents available to assist if significant developments emerged. The case remained open in federal databases, and Agent Foster maintained regular contact with local investigators to review any new evidence or potential connections to other crimes. Brown County's sense of normalcy remained elusive even a year after the shooting. Parents still worried when their children were out of sight, residents remained hyper-aware of their surroundings, and the simple act of driving alone on rural roads carried new anxieties. The community had adapted to living with unresolved fear, but the emotional toll was evident in changed behaviors and heightened tensions. The investigation team had grown smaller but remained dedicated. Detective Martinez coordinated with the Ohio Bureau of Criminal Investigation to periodically review all evidence with fresh eyes, hoping that new forensic techniques or different analytical approaches might reveal previously overlooked clues. Science continued to advance, offering hope that future developments might crack even the most challenging cold cases. Britney's parents, Janet and Robert Stikes, had transformed their grief into determined advocacy for justice. They established a scholarship fund in their daughter's memory, created a foundation to support other families affected by violent crime, and maintained constant communication with investigators to ensure the case never lost priority. "We won't let her be forgotten," Janet declared during a television interview marking the 18-month anniversary of the murder. "Every day we wake up thinking about her, and we go to sleep praying that tomorrow will bring the answers we need. Someone out there knows what happened, and we're not giving up until they come forward." The family's persistence had kept media attention focused on the case longer than typical unsolved crimes. Their regular appeals for information, their dignified handling of unthinkable loss, and their granddaughter's remarkable recovery story continued to resonate with audiences across Ohio and beyond. The child's development milestones became sources of bittersweet celebration. Her first steps, first words, and second birthday party were joyous occasions, shadowed by the absence of the young mother who should have been there to witness these precious moments. The grandmother who had raised her spoke often of Britney, ensuring the child would grow up knowing her mother's love, even in death. Community support for the family remained strong, but had evolved from immediate crisis response to long-term commitment. Local businesses continued fundraising efforts, churches maintained prayer ministries, and neighbors offered practical help with childcare and daily tasks. Brown County's response to tragedy demonstrated the best of small-town values and mutual support. The investigation had settled into a routine of periodic review and follow-up on occasional new tips. Detective Martinez maintained detailed files on every aspect of the case, organized systems for tracking potential leads, and regular communication with other agencies that might encounter related evidence. Her dedication to solving Britney's murder had become a defining aspect of her career in law enforcement. Sheriff Thompson faced political pressure during his re-election campaign, with opponents criticizing the lack of progress on the county's most high-profile unsolved case. However, voters recognized the complexity of the investigation and the department's continued commitment to finding answers. His victory reflected community confidence in ongoing efforts to achieve justice for Britney and her family. The broader law enforcement community had embraced the case as a test of their collective capabilities. Training conferences featured presentations about the investigation, seeking insights from experienced officers who might recognize patterns or suggest new approaches. The case had become a learning opportunity, as well as an ongoing search for justice. Advances in forensic technology offered new hope for solving cold cases that had stumped investigators for years. The Ohio Bureau of Criminal Investigation's crime laboratory acquired enhanced DNA analysis capabilities, improved ballistics matching systems, and sophisticated computer modeling programs that might reveal previously undetectable connections between evidence and suspects. Dr. Chen revisited Britney's case with these new tools, reprocessing evidence that had yielded no results with earlier technology. The enhanced DNA analysis could detect genetic material from increasingly small samples, potentially revealing trace evidence that had been below detection thresholds in 2013. Technology keeps advancing. Dr. Chen explained to Detective Martinez during one of their periodic case reviews, "What we couldn't see 5 years ago might be visible now. What we can't see today might be obvious 5 years from now. We never stop trying new approaches." The ballistics evidence received particular attention with new computer modeling software that could more precisely match bullets to specific firearms. The 308 Winchester bullets recovered from the scene were compared against an ever-expanding database of test fires from seized weapons, hoping to find the match that would identify both the gun and its owner. Digital forensics had also evolved significantly, offering new possibilities for analyzing cell phone data, social media activities, and electronic financial records. Investigators used these tools to create more detailed timelines of Britney's final days, looking for patterns or connections that might have been missed in the original investigation. The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit had refined their offender profile based on new research into similar crimes and improved understanding of criminal psychology. The updated profile suggested the shooter might have had personal knowledge of Britney's routine, indicating a connection to her life that investigators had not yet discovered. Detective Martinez coordinated with other agencies to share information about similar unsolved cases, looking for patterns that might indicate a serial offender. The enhanced communication between jurisdictions had already solved several cold cases nationwide, proving the value of persistent cooperation and information sharing. Local media continued periodic coverage of the case, often focusing on technological advances that might eventually solve the mystery. These stories serve both to maintain public awareness and to remind potential witnesses that their information remained valuable even years after the crime. The third anniversary of Britney's murder brought renewed attention to the case, but also growing frustration with the lack of progress. Community members who had initially rallied around the family with unwavering support began to express doubts about whether the crime would ever be solved. The anniversary vigil drew a smaller crowd than previous years, reflecting the natural erosion of public attention over time. Sheriff Thompson acknowledged the community's frustration while defending his department's continued efforts. "I understand people are disappointed," he said during the anniversary press conference. "We're disappointed too, but giving up is not an option. As long as I'm sheriff, this case will remain a priority. Someone knows what happened, and we're going to keep asking until they tell us. The investigation had consumed thousands of hours of detective time and tens of thousands of dollars in forensic analysis, creating budget pressures that required careful justification to county commissioners. Thompson had to balance fiscal responsibility with his commitment to pursuing justice, a challenge that many law enforcement agencies faced with long-term unsolved cases. Agent Foster from the FBI maintained periodic contact with local investigators, offering assistance when new leads emerged, but acknowledging the federal government's limited resources for cases without clear interstate connections. The relationship between local and federal authorities remained positive, but the day-to-day responsibility for the investigation rested firmly with Brown County. Brittany's daughter continued to thrive despite the traumatic beginning to her life. Now, a talkative 3-year-old with bright eyes and an infectious smile, she had become a source of joy and hope for everyone who knew her story. Her resilience served as a daily reminder of what had been saved, even as the family continued grieving what had been lost. The child's grandmother had become her primary caregiver, creating a stable and loving environment that helped minimize the long-term effects of early trauma. Extended family members provided additional support, ensuring the child would grow up surrounded by people who had known and loved her mother. New tips still arrived occasionally, usually prompted by anniversary coverage or documentary programs about unsolved crimes. Detective Martinez evaluated each one carefully, hoping to find the piece of information that would transform their cold case back into an active investigation. Most tips proved irrelevant, but the possibility of a breakthrough kept hope alive. By 2016, the investigation had settled into a pattern of periodic review and occasional flurries of activity when new tips emerged. Detective Martinez had become the institutional memory for the case, maintaining detailed files and developing expertise in every aspect of the crime. Her colleagues respected her dedication but worried about the emotional toll of carrying such a heavy burden for so long. The Brown County Sheriff's Office had solved numerous other cases during the intervening years, demonstrating their investigative capabilities and maintaining community confidence in local law enforcement. However, Britney's murder remained the most high-profile unsolved case, a constant reminder of the limitations that even dedicated professionals faced when confronted with a perfect crime. Rumors and speculation had filled the void left by official silence about the investigation's progress. Coffee shop conversations and social media discussions generated theories that ranged from plausible to absurd, creating a background noise of suspicion and mistrust that affected community relationships. The absence of facts had been replaced by an abundance of unfounded assumptions. Some community members had begun to accept that the case might never be solved, a psychological adaptation that allowed them to move forward with their lives while still hoping for eventual justice. Others remained convinced that authorities were withholding information or had failed to pursue obvious leads, creating tensions that reflected broader societal skepticism about institutional competence. The family's public profile had evolved from grieving victims to persistent advocates for justice. Their media appearances and public statements demonstrated remarkable strength and dignity under circumstances that would have destroyed less resilient people. Their example inspired other families facing similar tragedies while maintaining pressure on authorities to continue their search for answers. Brittany's daughter had started attending preschool, reaching developmental milestones that would have filled her mother with pride. The child's teachers and classmates were largely unaware of her dramatic early history, allowing her to experience normal childhood activities without the burden of being defined by tragedy. The investigation team had been reduced to Detective Martinez and occasional consulting assistance from state and federal partners. The reality of limited resources meant that active investigation occurred mainly when new leads emerged, with most of the detectives' time devoted to other cases that showed more promise for resolution. As the 5th anniversary of Britney's murder approached, Detective Martinez made a decision that would reinvigorate the investigation. She requested permission to submit the case to the FBI's Cold Case Initiative, a federal program that brought fresh analytical perspectives to stalled investigations. The program had achieved notable successes with cases that had frustrated local authorities for years. The Cold Case Initiative review process involved complete re-examination of all evidence, re-interviews with key witnesses, and application of new investigative techniques that had been developed since the original investigation. Agent Foster coordinated the federal review while maintaining respect for the work that local authorities had already completed. Sometimes a fresh set of eyes can see things that investigators who have been close to a case might miss. Agent Foster explained to Sheriff Thompson, "We're not criticizing the work that's been done. We're just hoping that a different perspective might reveal something new." The federal review team spent months analyzing every aspect of the case, From the initial crime scene investigation through years of follow-up work, they interviewed family members, friends, and potential witnesses who had been questioned previously, looking for inconsistencies or overlooked details that might provide new investigative directions. Advances in geographic profiling, a technique that analyzed crime locations to predict offender residence patterns, offered new possibilities for narrowing the suspect pool. Computer models could now process vast amounts of data to identify patterns invisible to human analysis, potentially revealing the mathematical fingerprint of a serial offender. The review also included consultation with retired investigators who had worked similar cases, bringing decades of experience to bear on the mystery. These seasoned professionals offered insights based on patterns they had observed over long careers, suggesting investigative approaches that might not have occurred to younger officers. The media attention surrounding the Cold Case Initiative review generated dozens of new tips from the public. People who had been reluctant to come forward earlier were encouraged by the renewed federal interest, believing that their information might finally receive the attention it deserved. Detective Martinez worked overtime to evaluate each tip, hoping that one might contain the key to solving the case. The 10-year anniversary of Britney's murder in 2023 marked a significant milestone in the investigation. A decade had passed since that terrible evening on State Route 68, yet the case remained as compelling and frustrating as ever. The anniversary brought extensive media coverage, with documentaries and podcast series examining every aspect of the crime and its aftermath. Britney's daughter, now 11 years old and thriving in school, had grown into a bright and resilient child who brought joy to everyone who knew her. She participated in the anniversary memorial service, lighting a candle in memory of the mother she had never really known, but whose love continued to surround her through family stories and photographs. "She would be so proud of the young lady you're becoming," Janet Stikes told her granddaughter during the emotional ceremony. "Every day you grow more beautiful, more intelligent, more kind, just like your mama was. She's watching over you, and she's so proud." The community response to the 10th anniversary demonstrated that Brown County had not forgotten Britney or abandoned hope for justice. Local businesses again donated to the reward fund, churches organized special prayer services, and residents wore yellow ribbons in honor of Britney's yellow Jeep. The collective memory of tragedy had been transformed into a shared commitment to remembrance and justice. Sheriff Thompson, now in his final term before retirement, used the anniversary as an opportunity to reflect on the case that had defined much of his career. 10 years is a long time, but it's not forever, he told the gathered crowd. "We've never stopped working this case, never stopped believing that someone knows what happened, never stopped hoping that they'll find the courage to come forward." Detective Martinez, now a sergeant and the department's lead investigator on cold cases, had become nationally recognized for her persistence and expertise. She had spoken at law enforcement conferences, consulted on similar cases in other jurisdictions, and maintained correspondence with families of unsolved murder victims across the country. Britney's case had shaped her career and her understanding of the complex relationship between justice and time. The investigation files now filled multiple filing cabinets, representing thousands of hours of work by dozens of professionals who had contributed their expertise to the search for answers. Every lead had been followed, every possible suspect investigated, every piece of evidence analyzed with the most advanced techniques available. Yet the killer remained unidentified, hidden somewhere in the vast landscape of possibilities. New technologies continued to emerge with promise for solving cold cases. Genetic genealogy had revolutionized forensic identification, using DNA evidence to trace family relationships that could eventually lead to suspects. The technique had solved dozens of cases that had baffled investigators for decades, offering new hope for Britney's case if any usable genetic evidence could be recovered from the crime scene. In early 2025, more than 11 years after Britney's murder, Detective Sergeant Martinez received a call that would change everything about the case. A woman in neighboring Highland County had been reviewing old family photographs and discovered images that might be relevant to the investigation. Her ex-husband had owned a .308 Winchester rifle and had been acting strangely around the time of Britney's murder. "I didn't think much of it at the time," the caller explained, her voice trembling with nervous energy. "But after our divorce, I found some things that didn't make sense. He had newspaper clippings about the shooting, and he got rid of his rifle right after it happened. I've been afraid to call for years, but I can't live with this anymore." Martinez felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that came with potentially significant developments. She had received hundreds of similar calls, over the years, most leading nowhere, but something about this woman's tone suggested genuine importance. The detective arranged an immediate interview, hoping that this might finally be the break the case desperately needed. The woman, identified as Rebecca Matthews, had been married to Thomas Matthews at the time of Britney's murder. She brought with her a box of items she had discovered while cleaning out their former home, including newspaper clippings about the case, receipts from a gun store, and handwritten notes that appeared to reference the shooting. Tom was always obsessed with guns and military tactics, Rebecca explained during the recorded interview. He talked about being a sniper, about how easy it would be to shoot someone from a distance. I thought it was just his fantasies, but after Britney was killed, he became different. Paranoid, secretive, aggressive. The evidence Rebecca provided included receipts showing that Thomas Matthews had sold his .308 Winchester rifle to a gun shop in Cincinnati just 2 weeks after Britney's murder. The timing was suspicious, but not conclusive proof of involvement. Matthews had no apparent connection to Britney, making it difficult to establish motive for the attack. Detective Martinez coordinated with the FBI and Ohio Bureau of Criminal Investigation to develop a strategy for investigating Matthews without alerting him to their suspicions. They needed more evidence before making any confrontational moves, but the lead represented the most promising development in years. Background investigation revealed that Matthews was a 4 or 5-year-old military veteran with specialized training in marksmanship and tactical operations. He had struggled with employment and relationships since leaving the service, displaying behaviors consistent with undiagnosed PTSD and increasing social isolation. The investigation of Thomas Matthews required careful coordination between multiple agencies to avoid compromising what might be their best opportunity to solve Britney's case. Surveillance teams established monitoring protocols while forensic experts prepared to examine any evidence that might be recovered from Matthews' residence or possessions. Agent Foster returned to Brown County to coordinate the federal response to this development. The FBI's involvement brought additional resources and expertise while ensuring that any eventual prosecution would have the strongest possible foundation. The stakes were too high to risk procedural errors that might allow a killer to escape justice. "We get one chance to do this right," Agent Foster emphasized during the investigative team briefing. "If Matthews is our shooter, we need overwhelming evidence to prove it. If he's not, we need to eliminate him as a suspect without compromising any other leads we might develop." The gun shop in Cincinnati that had purchased Matthews' rifle confirmed the transaction and provided serial number information that could potentially link the weapon to the bullets recovered from Britney's Jeep. However, the rifle had been resold multiple times since 2013, requiring additional investigation to locate it for ballistics testing. Psychological profilers from the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit reviewed the new information about Matthews and concluded that he fit many characteristics of their original offender profile. His military training, firearms expertise, and behavioral changes following the shooting aligned with their analysis of the crime's planning and execution. Detective Martinez coordinated with Highland County authorities who knew Matthews from previous encounters with law enforcement. He had been arrested twice for domestic violence, both times involving firearms, and had been the subject of mental health interventions after threatening neighbors. The pattern of escalating violence fit the profile of someone capable of the calculated attack on Britney. The surveillance operation revealed Matthews' daily routines, while investigators sought additional evidence that might support charges. They needed more than suspicious behavior and coincidental timing to build a case that could withstand the scrutiny of trial proceedings. The investigation required patience and precision to ensure that justice would finally be served. Britney's family was informed about the developments but asked to maintain confidentiality until the investigation could be completed. After more than 11 years of waiting, the possibility of answers brought both hope and anxiety about whether this lead would prove more substantial than previous disappointment. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. While researching Matthews' background, investigators discovered that his sister had posted family photographs on social media that inadvertently documented his presence in Brown County on the day of Britney's murder. The images showed Matthews at a family gathering just 20 miles from the crime scene, contradicting his previous statements about being out of state during that period. Detective Martinez felt the pieces beginning to align for the first time in over a decade. The geographic connection, the suspicious disposal of his rifle, his behavioral changes, and now proof of his presence in the area on the day of the murder created a compelling circumstantial case that warranted aggressive investigation. Agent Foster coordinated with federal prosecutors to prepare search warrant applications for Matthews' residence and any storage facilities he might be renting. The warrants needed to be comprehensive enough to recover any evidence while being specific enough to satisfy judicial review. The legal foundation had to be perfect to ensure that any evidence recovered would be admissible in court. The search warrant execution was planned as a coordinated operation involving local, state, and federal agents. Matthews had demonstrated familiarity with firearms and military tactics, requiring careful preparation to ensure officer safety while preserving evidence that might solve one of Ohio's most notorious cold cases. On March 15, 2025, at 6 a.m., law enforcement officers surrounded Thomas Matthews' residence in Highland County. The surprise raid recovered ammunition matching the .308 Winchester caliber used in Britney's murder, handwritten notes that appeared to reference the shooting, and computer files containing detailed information about the case that had never been publicly released. Matthews initially denied involvement in Britney's murder, but his story began to unravel under sustained questioning. Detective Martinez, drawing on 11 years of case knowledge, presented evidence that contradicted his claims and demonstrated the implausibility of his denials. After 12 hours of interrogation, Matthews finally confessed to shooting Brittany Stikes on August 28, 2013. The confession revealed a chilling motive rooted in mental illness and distorted thinking. Matthews claimed he had selected Britney randomly, wanting to commit the perfect murder to prove his tactical superiority. He had stalked several potential victims before choosing her based on her routine and the isolated location of the attack. The arrest sent shockwaves through both Brown County and Highland County communities. After more than 11 years of speculation and frustration, the man responsible for one of the region's most heinous crimes was finally in custody. The news spread rapidly through social media and traditional news outlets, bringing a mixture of relief and renewed grief to everyone who had followed the case. The news of Thomas Matthews' arrest reached Britney's family through a phone call from Detective Martinez that they had been hoping to receive for more than 11 years. Janet Stikes collapsed in tears, overwhelmed by the flood of emotions that accompanied the end of their long wait for justice. The arrest brought both closure and renewed pain as they confronted the reality of why their daughter had died. "I never stopped believing this day would come," Janet said through tears during an impromptu press conference outside the family home. "Britney can finally rest in peace knowing that the man who took her life will face justice. Our granddaughter can grow up knowing that the system worked, even though it took longer than we hoped." The community response was immediate and intense. Brown County residents gathered at the courthouse and the memorial site where Britney was remembered each year, sharing their relief and gratitude that the case had finally been solved. Local news stations provided continuous coverage as details of the arrest and confession became public. Sheriff Thompson, now weeks away from retirement, held a press conference to announce the successful conclusion of the investigation that had defined much of his final years in office. Standing beside Detective Martinez, Agent Foster, and other investigators who had worked the case, he thanked the community for their patience and persistence in keeping Britney's memory alive. "This arrest represents the best of law enforcement cooperation and dedication," Thompson declared. "Detective Martinez never gave up. Our federal partners provided crucial support, and the community never stopped hoping for justice. Britney Stikes can finally rest in peace, and her daughter can grow up knowing that justice was served." The legal proceedings would take months to complete, but Matthews' confession and the physical evidence recovered during the search provided a strong foundation for prosecution. District Attorney Sarah Williams announced her intention to seek the death penalty, citing the particularly heinous nature of the crime and the additional trauma inflicted on an innocent child. Britney's daughter, now 12 years old and mature enough to understand the significance of the arrest, participated in a family statement expressing gratitude to everyone who had worked to solve her mother's murder. Her poise and strength in the face of renewed attention demonstrated the resilience that had characterized her entire life. The arrest generated national media attention, with major news networks and true crime podcasts covering the resolution of a case that had captured public imagination for more than a decade. The story of persistence in the face of seemingly impossible odds resonated with audiences who had followed similar cases and hoped for similar resolutions. Thomas Matthews appeared in Brown County Common Pleas Court for his arraignment on charges of aggravated murder, attempted murder, and firearm specifications that could result in the death penalty. The courtroom was packed with family members, community residents, and media representatives who had followed the case since its beginning in 2013. Matthews, shackled and wearing an orange jail uniform, showed no emotion as the charges were read aloud. His court-appointed attorney entered a plea of not guilty by reason of insanity, setting up a legal battle that would focus on his mental state at the time of the shooting and his competency to stand trial. The prosecution team, led by District Attorney Williams, presented evidence of premeditation and careful planning that contradicted claims of mental illness. Matthews had demonstrated clear understanding of right and wrong, had taken steps to avoid detection, and had successfully evaded capture for more than 11 years through careful concealment of evidence. Britney's family attended every court hearing, their presence serving as a constant reminder of the human cost of Matthews' actions. They maintained their dignity throughout the proceedings while ensuring that Britney's memory remained central to the pursuit of justice. Their granddaughter, now old enough to understand the proceedings, chose not to attend but supported the family's decision to seek maximum punishment. The trial preparation revealed additional details about Matthews' planning and execution of the murder. He had conducted surveillance of potential victims for weeks before selecting Britney, had practiced shooting at similar distances, and had prepared escape routes and alibis in advance. The level of premeditation contradicted any claims of impaired mental capacity. Detective Martinez testified about the 11-year investigation, walking the jury through the methodical process that had eventually identified Matthews as the perpetrator. Her testimony highlighted the dedication of law enforcement professionals who had refused to give up despite years of frustration and dead ends. The defense team struggled to present a coherent argument for mental illness given the overwhelming evidence of planning and rational behavior. Matthews' military training and tactical expertise worked against claims of diminished capacity, demonstrating his ability to think clearly and execute complex plans even while dealing with psychological issues. The jury deliberated for less than 6 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all charges. The evidence of premeditation, the callous disregard for innocent life, and Matthews' own confession left little room for doubt about his responsibility for Britney's murder and the attempted murder of her child. The sentencing hearing for Thomas Matthews drew an even larger crowd than his trial, with people traveling from across Ohio to witness the final chapter in one of the state's most notorious cold cases. Britney's family was granted the opportunity to present victim impact statements that would help the judge determine whether Matthews would receive life in prison or the death penalty. Janet Stikes spoke first, her voice steady despite the tears that flowed as she described the impact of losing her daughter and nearly losing her granddaughter. "You didn't just kill Britney," she said, looking directly at Matthews. "You killed our dreams, our peace of mind, our sense of safety in the world, but you didn't kill our love for her or our determination to see justice done." The child who had survived Matthews' attack, now 13 years old, chose to address the court in a written statement that was read by the prosecutor. Her words demonstrated remarkable maturity and strength. "I don't remember my mother, but I feel her love every day through my family. The man who tried to kill us both failed because love is stronger than hate, and good people never stop fighting for what's right." Matthews was given the opportunity to address the court before sentencing but declined to speak. His silence stood in stark contrast to the emotional testimony from Britney's family and the community members who had been affected by his actions. The absence of remorse or explanation left many questions unanswered about his motives and mindset. Judge Robert Harrison delivered a sentence of death by lethal injection, citing the aggravating circumstances of the case and the complete lack of mitigating factors that might have justified a lesser punishment. The sentence brought applause from the courtroom gallery, reflecting the community's desire for ultimate justice in response to ultimate evil. The legal process would continue through mandatory appeals and review procedures that could take years to complete. However, the conviction and death sentence provided a sense of closure that had eluded Britney's family and the community for more than a decade. Justice had been delayed, but it had not been denied. Detective Martinez, now planning her own retirement after a distinguished career highlighted by her work on this case, reflected on the long journey from crime scene to courtroom. "It took 12 years, but we never stopped believing that this day would come," she said. "Britney's family deserved answers, and they never stopped fighting for them. That's what made the difference." The Biscayne Graint case had become a textbook example of how persistence, technological advancement, and community support could eventually solve even the most challenging cold cases. Law enforcement agencies across the country studied the investigation as a model for handling similar cases, learning from both the successes and the setbacks that had characterized the long pursuit of justice. The story of Brittany Stikes had transformed from a tale of senseless violence into an inspiration for families facing similar tragedies and law enforcement professionals dealing with seemingly impossible cases. Her legacy lived on through her daughter's resilience, her family's advocacy, and the community's commitment to never forgetting victims of violent crime. 5 months after Thomas Matthews' sentencing, Brown County gathered for a memorial service that celebrated both Britney's life and the resolution of her case. The service was different from previous annual remembrances because it carried a sense of completion that had been absent for more than 12 years. Justice had finally been served, allowing the community to properly honor Britney's memory without the shadow of an unsolved crime. The memorial featured speakers who had known Britney personally, sharing stories that painted a picture of a young woman whose kindness and optimism had touched everyone around her. Friends from high school recalled her infectious laughter and dreams of raising a large, loving family. Co-workers remembered her dedication and positive attitude even during difficult times. Pastor Edwards, who had delivered Britney's eulogy more than a decade earlier, spoke about the journey from tragedy to justice that had tested everyone's faith but ultimately demonstrated the power of persistence and community support. Britney's story doesn't end with her death or even with her killer's conviction, he said. It continues through her daughter, through the lives she touched, and through the example of never giving up on justice. Britney's daughter, now a teenager preparing for high school, participated in the service by reading a poem she had written about mothers she had never known but whose love continued to guide her life. Her words brought tears to the eyes of everyone present, demonstrating how the legacy of love could transcend even death and violence. The service concluded with the unveiling of a permanent memorial in Britney's honor, funded by donations from community members who wanted to ensure that her story would never be forgotten. The memorial featured her photograph, a brief biography highlighting her roles as daughter, wife, and mother, and an inscription that read, "Her light continues to shine through those who loved her and those who fought for justice." Detective Martinez, recently retired but still actively involved in cold case consulting, spoke about the importance of never giving up on victims and their families. "Every case matters, every victim deserves justice, and every family deserves answers," she said. "Britney's case taught me that time doesn't heal all wounds, but it can eventually reveal all truths." The gathering represented more than just a memorial service. It was a community's collective exhale after holding its breath for more than 12 years. The resolution of Britney's case had restored faith in the justice system and demonstrated that even the most challenging crimes could eventually be solved through dedication and persistence. As the crowd dispersed, many attendees stopped at the memorial to leave flowers, say prayers, or simply stand in silent reflection about the journey from tragedy to justice that had defined their community for more than a decade. The memorial would serve as a permanent reminder that love endures, justice prevails, and good people never stop fighting for what's right. The final chapter of Brittany Stikes' story closed not with her death on a country road in 2013, but with the knowledge that justice had finally been served and her memory would live on through the daughter she had protected with her final breath. Thomas Matthews sat on death row, facing the consequences of his actions, while Britney's legacy continued to inspire others facing similar tragedies. The case had become a symbol of hope for families dealing with unsolved crimes, demonstrating that persistence and faith could eventually overcome even the most challenging obstacles to justice. Detective Martinez received letters from families across the country who drew strength from Britney's story and the determination that had eventually solved her case. Brown County had been forever changed by the experience of living with an unsolved murder for more than a decade. The community had learned difficult lessons about trust, safety, and the importance of supporting each other through trauma. They had also learned that good people working together could overcome evil, even when success seemed impossible. Britney's daughter continued to thrive, her resilience serving as a daily reminder of what had been saved from the violence that claimed her mother's life. She carried forward the best qualities of the woman she had never really known: kindness, strength, optimism, and an unshakable faith in the power of love to overcome darkness. The investigation had consumed more than 12 years and thousands of hours of work by dozens of dedicated professionals. It had tested the limits of forensic science, investigative techniques, and human persistence, but it had ultimately succeeded in its fundamental mission, ensuring that a killer faced justice and that a victim was never forgotten. The story of Brittany Sheree Stykes stood as both tragedy and testament, a reminder that evil exists in the world, but that good people will never stop fighting against it. Her death had been senseless, but her legacy was meaningful. Her life had been cut short, but her impact would endure through all the lives she had touched and all the people who had refused to let her story end with violence. In the years that followed Matthew's conviction, Britney's case would be studied by law enforcement academies, featured in true crime documentaries, and referenced by other families seeking justice for their own loved ones. Her story had become part of the larger narrative about crime and justice in America, proof that the arc of justice might be long, but it ultimately bends toward righteousness. The final artifact in Britney's story was not a piece of physical evidence or a legal document, but something intangible yet powerful, the collective memory of a community that had refused to forget, a family that had never stopped believing, and a system of justice that had eventually worked despite its imperfections and delays.